The Moulin Rouge, Paris, in the autumn of 1944. Behind the great red windmill, in the narrow dark of the wings, a tall young man from Marseille stood with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, certain that his name was about to be crossed off the bill. He was 23 years old, his shoes were worn thin from walking, and he was convinced in that moment that the woman standing under the stage light was about to end his career before it had truly begun. What she said to him instead, 6 quiet words spoken without turning fully toward him, would follow him for the rest of his life. He would repeat them to friends decades later in a low voice, as if they still surprised him. But to understand why those 6 words mattered so much, you have to understand who was standing in that light and how close the young man in the shadows had come to disappearing. His name was Yves Montand, though almost no one in Paris knew it yet. He had come up from the south, from the docks and the working-class streets near Marseille, a boy who had loaded crates and swept factory floors before he ever dreamed of a stage. He sang the way a laborer sings, big, open, unpolished, arms wide, more energy than technique. In the music halls of the South, he had been a sensation, but Paris was not the South. Paris had heard everything. Paris was cold and quick to decide, and it did not care where a young man had come from. In the autumn of 1944, the city was still catching its breath. The occupation had only just ended. The streets smelled of liberation and hunger at once. And into that raw, uncertain Paris, Yves Montand had arrived with a suitcase, a handful of songs, and the terrible feeling that he did not yet know what kind of performer he was supposed to be. What Montand did not fully understand yet was how precarious his place on that stage really was. He had been added to the program almost as an afterthought. The bookers were not sure about him. He was too rough for some, too loud for others. A Southern boy who did not yet fit the elegant idea of a Paris headliner. Rumors moved fast through the corridors of the Moulin Rouge, and the rumor that reached Montand was simple and devastating: that he might be dropped, that the top of the bill belonged to Piaf and Piaf alone, and that a struggling newcomer was a risk no one wanted to carry. So on that autumn night, he stood in the wings, not as a rising star, but as a young man waiting to be told he was finished. And Piaf, for all her fame, was not standing in an easy place either. She was in her late 20s, already carrying the weight of a career that had asked everything of her. She had lost people. She had been doubted, managed, warned, and underestimated. She knew what it was to be treated as a novelty, a curiosity from the gutter who had gotten lucky. She had fought her way out of that judgment with sheer will and an instinct for a song that no teacher could have given her. So when she looked into the wings and saw the frightened young man from Marseille, she did not see a rival. She saw a version of herself from years before, talented, terrified, and one bad week away from being forgotten. That recognition would change both of their lives. The woman under the light was Edith Piaf. By then, she was already Paris itself. Small, dressed in plain black, no taller than a schoolgirl, and somehow able to fill a theater to its farthest corner with nothing but her voice. She had come from the streets too, from a childhood so hard that most people softened it when they told it. She had sung on sidewalks for coins before she ever sang in a hall. And because of that, she understood something that the polished managers of Paris did not. She understood what it looked like when a performer had the fire, but not yet the shape. She had seen Montand on the same bill, watched him from the side of the stage, and she had noticed everything: the raw power, the wasted gestures, the way he sang past the audience instead of to them. She saw a young man who could either become extraordinary or vanish completely. And Paris, that autumn, was leaning toward vanish. To understand what she saw in him, you have to picture the young Montand as Paris first met him. He was all motion. He sang with his whole body, throwing his arms toward the balcony, pushing his voice out until it filled every inch of the hall, sweating through his shirt by the second song. In the South, that had been enough. Audiences there loved a big, generous performer who gave them everything at once. But in a Paris theater, in the hushed intimacy of the Moulin Rouge, all that force could read as noise. The subtlety was missing. The stillness was missing. And an audience that had lived through years of fear did not want to be shouted at. They wanted to be understood. Piaf could see the gap between what Montand was doing and what the room actually needed, and she could see that he had no idea the gap was there. That, more than his talent, was what worried her. A performer who does not know what he is missing cannot fix it in time. Stop singing to them. Sing for them. That was all. 6 words. She did not explain them. She did not soften them. She turned back toward the light and left him standing there, with the whole meaning of his career folded into a single sentence. Stop singing to them. Stop performing at the audience. Stop throwing your arms and your voice out into the dark to impress a room that had already impressed itself 1,000 times. Sing for them, as if each person out there had come with a private sorrow, a private hope, and you had been sent out simply to say it for them, because they could not say it themselves. It was the difference between a man showing off and a man telling the truth. And in that instant, standing in the wings of the Moulin Rouge, Yves Montand understood that he had been doing the first thing his entire life. When his cue came, he walked out differently, not louder, quieter. He did not attack the room. He let the first line settle, and he sang it as if he were confiding it to one person in the 10th row. The big arms came down. The forced energy fell away. And something in the theater shifted. The murmur thinned. The smoke seemed to still. And a room that had been ready to tolerate him began, instead, to lean toward him. He was not performing anymore. He was speaking to them, one by one, in the dark. By the end of the song, the applause was not polite. It was surprised. It was the sound of an audience realizing they had just watched a young man become the performer he was going to be. The night moved toward its center the way those nights did, slowly, then all at once. Out front, the Moulin Rouge was full. The red velvet, the smoke, the low, warm light, the murmur of an audience that had survived a war and wanted, more than anything, to feel something again. Montand was to go on before her. He could hear the room. He could hear how it did not yet belong to him. And he could feel in his chest the cold certainty that when he walked out there, he would lose them, and that losing them would be the end. He had come all the way to Paris to fail on the most famous stage in the city. In the wings, he could barely breathe. It was then that Edith Piaf came off the light for a moment, into the half-dark where he stood. She was smaller up close than the stage made her seem, and her eyes were quick and unsentimental. She looked at him, not with pity, which he could have survived, but with something harder and more useful. She looked at him the way a person looks at something worth saving. The orchestra was waiting. The audience was waiting. There were 100 things a headliner might have said to a nervous opening act, and most of them would have been kind and forgettable. Piaf did not say any of those things. She stepped close, held his eyes, and said 6 words, low and even, meant only for him. Their story, of course, became more than mentorship. For a time they were inseparable, 2 people from the same broken beginnings who understood each other without translation. She lifted him, and loving her lifted him further. And when that chapter eventually closed, as those chapters do, it left something in him that never left. Because whatever happened between them as 2 people, the artist she had made was permanent. Yves Montand would go on to become one of the great figures of French entertainment, a star of the stage and the screen, admired across the world, filling the largest halls in Paris and beyond entirely on his own name. But he never told the story of his beginning without her at the center of it. He never pretended he had done it alone, and he never stopped repeating those 6 words. Long after Piaf was gone, when Montand was himself an old lion of French music, interviewers would ask him how he had learned to hold an audience the way he did, with that famous ease, that intimacy, the sense that he was singing to each person alone. He would grow quiet, and sometimes he would tell them about a frightened night at the Moulin Rouge in 1944, and a small woman in a black dress who had stepped out of the light for a moment to save a career that was not yet a career. Stop singing to them. Sing for them. He said it changed everything. He said he had spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. What no one in that theater could have known was that they were watching a method being born in real time. The thing Piaf had handed him in 6 words was not a trick or a gesture. It was an entire philosophy of performance, and it would define Montand for the next 50 years. Everyone who saw him in the decades that followed, in the great concert halls, on film, in front of thousands, would describe the same quality, that uncanny sense that he was singing to them personally, that the enormous room had somehow shrunk to the size of a private conversation. Critics would call it warmth, or honesty, or presence, and reach for words to explain a thing they could not quite name. But it had a birthplace, and it had a date. It was born in the wings of the Moulin Rouge in the autumn of 1944, in the space of a single sentence from a woman who had learned it the hard way on the sidewalks of Paris. Piaf, watching from the wings now, said nothing. She did not need to. She had handed him the one thing no booker, no manager, and no amount of ambition could have given him, the knowledge of what a song was actually for. In the weeks that followed, she took him further into her world. She reshaped his material, changed the way he moved, taught him to trust stillness, taught him that restraint could hit harder than force. She was not gentle about it, she never was. But she gave him the map she had drawn from her own hard years, and he followed it. The rough boy from Marseille began, night after night, to disappear, and in his place stood a singer of real gravity, a man who could quiet a room simply by lowering his voice. There is a particular kind of gift that only one artist can give another. Not money, not a booking, not a name on a marquee, but a single true thing said at exactly the right moment, when it can still change the shape of a life. Edith Piaf gave that gift in the space of a breath, in the wings of a Paris theater, on a night that could easily have been forgotten. She did not do it for credit. She turned back to the light and went on with her own performance, and probably thought little of it afterward. But the young man in the shadows carried it out into the world and made a whole career out of it. And every time he lowered his voice and told the truth to a silent hall, he was, in a way, still standing in those wings, hearing her say it. Paris remembers Edith Piaf as a voice, as a legend, as the small woman in black who sang of love and loss and no regret. But there was another thing she was, quieter and less sung about. A woman who knew, better than anyone, how easily a great talent could be lost, and who chose, more than once, to reach into the shadows and pull someone into the light. Yves Montand was the proof. 6 words in the dark, and a whole life that never forgot them.